I solemnly swear I am up to no good. Welcome to Dear Mr. Potter. I'm Alistair Stevens. This week in our 56th session, we move toward the very end of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, and we get some important answers to some important, outstanding questions. In theory, we will get through chapters 35 and 36 this week after finishing chapter 34, from which we have just a couple of slides left to break down and discuss. But as I said last time, I'm not actually hopeful that we're going to make it through all of chapter 36, which means that next week we get to conclude chapter 36 and chapter 37, which will also mean the end of the book. That's it. 2 more live sessions here in our discussion of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. I will then take, just a quick scheduling announcement here at the beginning, I'm going to take the following week off. I'm suspending all of my live shows for the following week because it is my birthday week, and it's going to be a week of summer vacation and also catching up with a ton of very, very smart email, mostly about Dear Mr. Potter, the influx of new emails to the Dear Mr. Potter, to the dedicated Dear Mr. Potter email account. There isn't one, it's just my regular email account, but you guys are particularly smart. There's a mountain of email awaiting my attention there, so I'll also do that in the week off, but that means that I will return on the 19th of June with a discussion of the movie adaptation of Goblet of Fire, which I just watched again for the first time since starting this discussion, and there's a lot to like in the movie adaptation. I think one might argue that Goblet of Fire, the movie adaptation, is the best piece of adaptation that we get. It is the most free piece of adaptation. It is arguably the most purposeful piece of adaptation that we get in the entire Harry Potter series. It is not, I think, the most successful movie. I don't think that it is going to astonish anyone that it is not my favorite of the Harry Potter films, but I do think that there are some really interesting things happening under the surface, and we will discuss all of that on the 19th of June. And then we're going to take a break. We're going to talk about some other books, and then we'll come back for Order of the Phoenix in just a little bit. Let's begin today's reading, though, picking up where we left off last week in the end of chapter 34, Priori Incantatem, with the appearance of Lily. Let's get to this slide. And now another head was emerging from the tip of Voldemort's wand, and Harry knew when he saw it who it would be. He knew as though he had expected it from the moment when Cedric had appeared from the wand, knew because the woman was the one he'd thought of more than any other tonight. The smoky shadow of a young woman with long hair fell to the ground as Bertha had done, straightened up and looked at him. And Harry, his arms shaking madly now, looked back into the ghostly face of his mother. "Your father's coming," she said quietly. "Hold on for your father. It will be all right. Hold on." And he came. First his head, then his body, tall and untidy-haired like Harry. The smoky, shadowy form of James Potter blossomed from the end of Voldemort's wand, fell to the ground and straightened like his wife. He walked close to Harry, looking down at him, and he spoke in the same distant, echoing voice as the others, but quietly, so that Voldemort, his face now livid with fear as victims prowled around him, could not hear. "When the connection is broken, we will linger for only moments, but we will give you time. You must get to the portkey. It will return you to Hogwarts. Do you understand, Harry?" "Yes," Harry gasped, fighting now to keep a hold on his wand, which was slipping and sliding beneath his fingers. "Harry," whispered the figure of Cedric, "take my body back, will you? Take my body back to my parents." "I will," said Harry, his face screwed up with the effort of holding his wand. So, the reverse spell effect, which is going to be broken down for us in the very next chapter by Dumbledore, has caused the forms of those people who have been murdered by Voldemort to emerge from the end of his wand. We get the screaming, the constant screaming, which we have associated, as we discussed last time, with the consequence of the Cruciatus Curse, right? This is the reverse spell effect associated with the casting of the Cruciatus Curse. We just get to hear the screaming. Then we get the return of Cedric Diggory. Then we get Frank Bryce. Then we get Bertha Jorkins. Then we get Lily Evans. And then we get James Potter. We will be told later that Voldemort definitely cast another important spell during this period, that there is one very significant spell that has been cast during the period covered by this spell reversal effect, I suppose, which is not in any way acknowledged by the reversal effect itself. But I want to put a giant pin in that, because this is oftentimes held up as a mistake, as an oversight, as a loophole, as proof that J.K. Rowling has not thoroughly established her world, had not thoroughly established exactly what was going on vis-a-vis the fragments of Voldemort's soul, which will become so significant later. But we don't know the mechanic of that spell. We don't know how, and I know that I'm being particularly vague. I know I'm being horribly vague in this instance, but I don't want to necessarily tip my hand as to the spoiler. All I will say is that we don't know that Voldemort's wand was in any way associated with that spell casting, so it may not, in fact, be either a mistake or a retcon. it could also potentially be both. We should note, too, that in the original edition of the Goblet of Fire, there was a mistake in this sequence. James emerged first. He emerged before Lily, indicating that he was killed after her. That is non-canonical. That is untrue. That has been untrue for quite some time now, and it was, of course, revised in later editions. This is one of those rare instances where a mistake in the books has caused J.K. Rowling to simply acknowledge that it was an error, that it was just an oversight. There was a huge and complex editorial process. I mean, I'm sure that you can all imagine the pressure that was on J.K. Rowling and the pressure that was on her entire editorial team as Goblet of Fire was in its final stages of pre-production before its release, and there was simply an oversight. The original turn read like this. The smoky shadow of a tall man with untidy hair fell to the ground as Bertha had done, straightened up and looked at him, and Harry, his arms shaking madly now, looked back into the ghostly face of his father. Your mother's coming, he said quietly. She wants to see you. It will be all right. Hold on. And she came. First her head, then her body, a young woman with long hair. The smoky, shadowy form of Lily Potter blossomed from the end of Voldemort's wand, fell to the ground and straightened like her husband. So you can see that that original version of this scene is very similar to the revised version. We just move some things around, which is entirely fine. You know what? Mistakes happen. I think that revising books always has, I think, particularly in the popular consciousness, a kind of unpleasant connotation that it is somehow revisionist in the connotative sense, not just the denotative sense, I suppose. It is, of course, literally a revision, but it also feels a little... It feels too much like sleight of hand for some readers. I know that some readers are made profoundly uncomfortable by this revision in later editions of Goblet of Fire and have actually tried to justify why it is that Lily is, or both James and Lily emerge from Voldemort's wand out of order, as it were. We should also note, while we're just ticking off possible controversies on the internet regarding this sequence, I suppose, that it is completely appropriate for Cedric Diggory to emerge. Technically, of course, Voldemort did not kill the Spare. Peter Pettigrew killed the Spare. But he is clearly, at that point, wielding Voldemort's wand. We can infer that from the pages of Goblet of Fire, but we will get absolute confirmation of that in later books, too. But when Peter Pettigrew dispatches Cedric Diggory, when he casts the killing curse on Cedric Diggory, he is wielding a wand in that moment. There was no other mention of a wand associated with Peter Pettigrew through the course of this part of Goblet of Fire. And then when he robes Voldemort later, Voldemort takes his wand from the pocket of his robe. So presumably that was replaced by Peter Pettigrew after the fact. So it is associated with the wand, not associated with the wizard, which is another really interesting push toward this idea that wands have a... Well, sentience is probably overstating it, right? But they have an identity. They have a quality of identity that is distinct from the wizard who wields it. This is, of course, going to be terribly important as we move into the latter books in the Harry Potter series. We're going to spend a lot of time thinking about individual wands, thinking about particular wands, but we haven't done a lot to establish that as yet. This is another one of those very quiet points of transformation, I suppose, points of evolution within our understanding of J.K. Rowling's wizarding world. So let's look at how this works. And now another head was emerging from the tip of Voldemort's wand. So we get this. I always had some trouble kind of imagining exactly what this looked like, the physical manifestation of these spirits, these presences, these fragments of soul. Again, another giant pin is going to be put in that idea because we will have to talk about that later. And this is... Well, this is potentially very, very interesting, but we need a lot more data before we can speculate about what it is that is manifesting here. And now another head was emerging from the tip of Voldemort's wand, and Harry knew when he saw it who it would be. He knew as though he had expected it from the moment when Cedric had appeared from the wand, knew because the woman was the one he'd thought of more than any other tonight. The smoky shadow of a young woman with long hair fell to the ground as Bertha had done, straightened up and looked at him, and Harry, his arms shaking madly now, looked back into the ghostly face of his mother. Harry's personal connection with his parents is something that I think J.K. Rowling has managed beautifully through the series thus far. We have had moments of real and intimate connection combined with this constant negative presence in his life. That is to say that he is constantly aware of the absence of his parents, but we get these moments of vision and visitation, I suppose. Most powerfully, arguably, the Mirror of Erised, of course, back in the first book. We've had the actual apprehension, the quasi-physical connection of Harry to the embodiments, to the representations, at least, of his mother and father. And here we get another perspective on that, another kind of partial and incomplete reunification between Harry and his parents, and yet more of a reunification than we might have any cause to expect. It's enormously powerful. Yeah. Oh, let me see. Camille says, where did Wormtail keep the wand when he was an animal? Along with that, can Animagi keep their clothes on when they are in animal form? It is implied that that is perhaps the case. Certainly in the films, it is implied that that is the case. We just don't know. We don't know where Voldemort's wand was or how it was directly recovered by Peter Pettigrew. There are some, of course, expansive pieces of speculation in that regard, but we just kind of have to whistle past that and fudge it a little bit to make all of this work. Yeah, good. Yeah, as C-Star saying, it appears Animagi can keep their clothes because we just don't want to deal with a naked Sirius Black, I think, more than anyone else. I think just a naked Sirius Black wandering around would be problematic. If Sirius had been naked in the following chapters of this book, I think we probably would have drawn some attention to that. But yeah, good. Yeah, Chris is saying, it was always a little odd to me that the reverse spell effect brings out the actual people killed by AK, unlike, say, Mors Mordre, where it shows the actual spell's effect. Yes, though we don't know for sure, and I kind of alighted on this a little in last week's discussion. We don't know for sure the difference between the reverse spell and the reverse spell effect. Prior Incantato is the reverse spell. That is what you use to reveal the last spell cast by a wand. Priori Incantatum seems to be something else. It is a more powerful kind of magical cascade effect associated with the wand, and we don't know if, open question, I suppose, if someone uses the killing curse and then prior Incantato is cast upon that wand, do we get the same kind of manifestation of the victim of that spell? If we do, well, I guess regardless whether we do or do not, we kind of have to speculate about what it is that is embodied within the wand that has now manifested itself here for Harry. Cedric obviously has a kind of awareness and a kind of sentience, as he says here at the end. Take my body back, will you? Take my body back to my parents. So he is aware of what has happened, is aware of Harry, is aware of the events that are unfolding, and is also crucially aware of the fact that he has been killed and is able to parse that, I suppose. Obviously, James Potter is able to do something very similar. When the connection is broken, we will linger for only moments, but we will give you time. You must get to the portkey. It will return you to Hogwarts. Do you understand, Harry? There is no way that James can have intuited that in this moment. There's no way that he has appeared for the first time in this place and realized that the Triwizard Cup on the ground is a portkey that will return Harry to Hogwarts. He clearly has a broader awareness. There is a nebulous and indefinable fragment of something that has had a continuation of existence trapped within, associated with, in a halo around Voldemort's wand. It's not entirely clear exactly how to follow that thread of awareness, how to follow that thread of sentience. Is this a manifestation of the wand itself? Is there some kind of element of the Phoenix Feather core of the wand, which is now made literally physically manifest or semi-physically manifest in this sequence? Well, we just don't know. We are going to be called upon, in fact, the series will demand that we spend a great deal of time speculating about what is and is not a person, what is and is not possessed of this kind of awareness and this continuity of experience later in the book series, which is why I'm loath to kind of try to define that too much. But let's absolutely bracket this right now by saying, yes, Cedric, when he emerges from the wand, clearly understands what has happened and what is going on. James, more importantly, when he emerges from the wand, demonstrates an awareness, a physical awareness of what has transpired and what has led our hero to this point. Thus, there is some kind of continuity of awareness associated with the reverse spell effect, yes, and also Avada Kedavra specifically. It's a little unclear. It's a little nebulous, but it is very, very powerful. Obviously, to descend into I'm aware that I'm inside of a glass house and I've just got a big pocket full of stones that I'm ready to throw at this point. But to descend into nitpickery at this point in the book is always tempting, of course. We want to understand the mechanics of magic in Harry Potter's world, but also we want to understand that immediate emotional effect here. For Lily to emerge, this person, the woman that he'd thought of more than any other tonight, right? Lily Potter, née Evans, has been a constant pressure on Harry's awareness throughout this entire experience, and now she is made manifest, and she says, your father's coming, hold on for your father, it will be all right, hold on. No word of direct support, no word of direct connection with Harry there, rather something more functional, something more practical in this moment. No, just wait. Your father's coming, and when he does, he's going to give you workable advice. Harry, by the way, which is a really interesting inversion of the significance of Lily Potter in this sequence. Of course, we just finished in last week's discussion a pretty thorough analysis of what it is that makes Lily special, what it is that distinguishes Lily Potter, I suppose, from, as far as we know, every other wizard of this age, every other wizard who has ever lived. None of them, apparently, by all accounts, has managed to accomplish what Lily Potter managed to accomplish in her choice, her desire to protect her son, right? The sacrificial charm seems to be, up until this point, something that is unique or almost unique. So it's interesting that when she emerges from Voldemort's wand here in the middle of the spell reversal effect, that she has nothing for Harry except, hang on, your dad's coming. And when James is here, he's going to actually give you the information, which almost inspires me to look at these phantoms that have emerged from the wand as something other than simple reproductions or representations of the people that they purport to be, if that makes sense. I'm wondering to what degree this is a manifestation of the wand. This is a manifestation of, or a consequence of Avada Kedavra specifically, or a consequence of the spell reversal effect specifically, and to what degree each of these phantoms is actually the person that they appear as. We can only speculate in that regard. We can only speculate, yeah. Let me see here. Angela, as Angela so often does, putting her finger on it perfectly. Does this mean that the Avada Kedavra curse takes some of the essence of the victim into the wand? That is a pretty compelling conclusion, I have to say, Angela. I am very inclined to agree with that conclusion. I find that conclusion all but inescapable. I suppose I would distill out one possible complication in that assertion, which is that we don't know for sure that it's Avada Kedavra, right? We don't know for sure that it is. This is Voldemort's go-to spell when he wants to kill someone. Of course it is. It is an unforgivable curse. Of course he's going to use that rather than any other spell that would presumably in some way achieve the same ends. The fact that it is unforgivable, the fact that it is nigh instantaneous, the fact that it is unblockable, all of these reasons explain why Voldemort goes to Avada Kedavra. So we can say for sure that that's how these people were killed. We can't say for sure that that is the reason why they are emerging from the wand at this point. Had this continued, as has been verified by J.K. Rowling on Pottermore and in other places too, had this process continued, we would presumably have just rewound through all of Voldemort's spellcasting for his entire career ever since he got his wand. So it would be interesting to see how that plays out. Yeah. I'm happy to read the screams as a manifestation of the Cruciatus Curse, or as a reproduction of the consequence of the Cruciatus Curse, I suppose, in much the same way as I was interested last week in the possibility that the Phoenix Song isn't inherent to this resonant interaction between the two wands, but is rather a consequence of Harry's casting of the Expecto Patronum charm or something like that, that it is another secondary magical effect. I think there's some space there for interesting speculation, but it's the kind of speculation that should probably take place very late at night after a glass or two of good wine, and just, you can relax, which of course is appropriate for all of you who are joining me today, because many of you are in the European time zone and are presumably relaxing with glasses of wine right now. All of that said, we now have our game plan. When the connection is broken, says James, we will linger for only moments, but we will give you time. You must get to the portkey. It will return you to Hogwarts. Do you understand, Harry? And then Cedric gives the request, the injunction to Harry, take my body back. Will you take my body back to my parents? I will, said Harry, his face screwed up with the effort of holding the wand. That physical interaction with the wand, I know I mentioned this last week, but the physical interaction of Harry struggling to hold the wand is very powerful at this point. I love that it isn't just about force of will, as the interactions of magic so often are within the frame of Harry Potter. This is a greater physical consequence, and I find that just lovely. I also find an interesting kind of an interesting connective thread leading back to the very beginning of this chapter when Voldemort is taunting Harry about dueling, and Harry has that memory of the dueling club that he attended for like 5 minutes 2 years ago before that whole enterprise was shut down. And he notes that the only thing he ever learned was Expelliarmus. The only thing he ever learned was how to remove an opponent's wand, and now here he is, though no one has cast Expelliarmus, struggling to hold on to his wand. There's a little resonance there that I enjoy a great deal too. With all of that said, let's get to the very end of this chapter and Harry's great escape. 10 feet from Cedric, Harry dived behind a marble angel to avoid the jets of red light and saw the tip of its wings shatter as the spells hit it. Gripping his wand more tightly, he dashed out from behind the angel. "Impedimenta!" he bellowed, pointing his wand wildly over his shoulder at the Death Eaters running at him. From a muffled yell, he thought he had stopped at least one of them, but there was no time to stop and look. He jumped over the cup and dived as he heard more wand blasts behind him. More jets of light flew over his head as he fell, stretching out his hand to grab Cedric's arm. "Stand aside! I will kill him! He is mine!" shrieked Voldemort. Harry's hand had closed on Cedric's wrist. One tombstone stood between him and Voldemort, but Cedric was too heavy to carry and the cup was out of reach. Voldemort's red eyes flamed in the darkness. Harry saw his mouth curl into a smile, saw him raise his wand. "Accio!" Harry yelled, pointing his wand at the Triwizard Cup. It flew into the air and soared toward him. Harry caught it by the handle. He heard Voldemort scream of fury at the same moment that he felt the jerk behind his navel that meant the portkey had worked. It was speeding him away in a whirl of wind and color, and Cedric along with him. They were going back. Harry being outright assaulted by the Death Eaters is another example of J.K. Rowling just blowing the doors off what is possible in the wizarding world. And of course, this is completely intentional. This is all-out wizarding warfare. We have never seen anything like this, even with the appearance of the Death Eaters at the Quidditch World Cup, of course. We have never seen anything quite like this. And this is an inversion of what is established right at the beginning of the chapter with Voldemort taunting Harry about dueling. You've learned how to duel. Albus Dumbledore would want you to display courtesy, right? First we bow to each other. He's observing the formal structure surrounding the duel of wizards, and then it all falls apart. Then it all collapses into outright assault and outright warfare. This is what Voldemort's tyranny would look like. This is what Voldemort's tyranny will look like. It's what it looked like before and will look like again, I suppose. This all-out assault is vivid and is immense and is overwhelming. This is where Harry notes that he is outnumbered at least 30-1, but thanks to the interposition of the phantoms roused by the reverse spell effect, he is able to escape thanks to the last minute application of the summoning charm. And I find this really, really interesting. Again, we talked about the purpose of the third task in the Triwizard Tournament, right? Stripping out all of the Voldemort stuff from this plot, imagining for a moment that this is just another Harry Potter adventure. This is just Harry Potter and the Triwizard Tournament, right? That Harry, in the course of the third task, that all of the champions in the course of the third task are going to be challenged on their general wizarding knowledge. Harry has learned more charms and practiced more charms and spells and jinxes for this third task than he has apparently throughout his entire time at Hogwarts. He now has a broad mastery of spellcraft, and he needs that broad mastery of spellcraft because that is what the third task is targeting. That is why his adventure in the maze is the logos part of that ethos, pathos, logos triplicate structure that we discussed before. It's because it's a test of his general education and knowledge. And now, even though things have taken a darker turn, even though he has been pulled out of the maze and dragged all the way to Little Hangleton, all the way to this graveyard, even though he has now been cast into a very different kind of story, the skills that he learned are still valuable. His education is still significant. There is again, while we're talking about continuity of experience, right? This is a very different kind of continuity of experience, but it is still a continuous experience nonetheless. He is still equipped in a really powerful way. And had the Triwizard Tournament been no more than it appeared to be, had it simply been, an intramural school sports day, then the spells that he had learned and the spells that he had practiced, Impedimenta and Accio, of course, would still be effective. So I like that even though we have dragged Harry out of his well, what we previously took to be his native milieu. Of course, that will turn out to not be true either. In fact, Harry is only just now beginning the adventure that will define the rest of his life. While we seem to have dragged Harry out of the sort of story we usually associate with Harry Potter and into a much more adult, much darker story, his skills are still important. They are still vital. He earns his escape here, and he earns it through the application of spellcraft. Yes, the impedimenta spell that he casts here does seem to be effective. From a muffled yell, he thought he had stopped at least one of them, but there was no time to stop and look. He's physically active, as he so often is in the end of book challenges, which he overcomes. And of course, the Accio charm, the summoning charm, that he learned and all but perfected prior to the very first challenge of the Triwizard Tournament. I like that we are kind of folding those two halves of the story back in on each other, maintaining a space between them. Of course, this is not a return to a high school adventure story or a boarding school adventure story. It is, gosh, very, very different from that, but it is still reflective. It is engaged in a discourse with that other kind of story, which I find completely fascinating. And that suspended discourse is going to be utterly significant. It is going to be the most important thing, one might argue, about the following two chapters as we get all of our great exposition here. Let me catch up. I just realized that the chat, I thought you were all very quiet for a moment and then realized that the chat had just stopped scrolling. Here we go. I want to catch up with... Oh, the curse of the villain monologue strikes again, says Becca. Yes, yes. C-Star saying, we definitely didn't learn the names of all the Death Eaters here or see Voldemort talk to them if there are so many. Yeah. Up until the point when Harry says that he is outnumbered 30-1, there is no reason for me to believe that there are any more than, what did we decide, 8, 9 Death Eaters present? But there's also no reason to doubt Harry, so I guess there are 30. We know some of them, as we discussed last week, but yeah, good. Okay. I think I'm caught up with the chat. That's all very good. Okay. Mela saying in the chat, we've got Austin Powers, we've got The Incredibles, we've got all the references here in chat. You're a very pop culturally literate lot is the thing, which I enjoy a great deal about these chats, obviously. All right. And then Marshall Moore saying, JKR continues to be bad at math. You know, the problem is she's just taking all those arithmetic classes and not actually taking real math classes. I think that's where we've come down to, yeah. And Angela wanting, as we all want, a Death Eater roll call. I think that would be instructive, if nothing else. Instructive, yes. Okay. With all of that, then we move into chapter 35, and we'll just pick up from the very next slide, in fact, as we get to chapter 35, Veritaserum. Harry felt himself slammed flat into the ground. His face was pressed into grass. The smell of it filled his nostrils. He had closed his eyes while the portkey transported him, and he kept them closed. Now, he did not move. All the breath seemed to have been knocked out of him. His head was swimming so badly he felt as though the ground beneath him were swaying like the deck of a ship. To hold himself steady, he tightened his hold on the two things he was still clutching, the smooth, cold handle of the Triwizard Cup and Cedric's body. He felt as though he would slide away into the blackness gathering at the edges of his brain if he let go of either of them. Shock and exhaustion kept him on the ground, breathing in the smell of the grass, waiting for someone to do something to happen, and all the while his scar burned dully on his forehead. A torrent of sound deafened and confused him. There were voices everywhere, footsteps, screams. He remained where he was, his face screwed up against the noise as though it were a nightmare that would pass. Then a pair of hands seized him roughly and turned him over. "Harry! Harry!" He opened his eyes. He was looking up at the starry sky, and Albus Dumbledore was crouched over him. The dark shadows of a crowd of people pressed in around them, pushing nearer. Harry felt the ground beneath his head reverberating with their footsteps. He had come back to the edge of the maze. He could see the stands rising above him, the shapes of people moving in them, the stars above. Harry let go of the cup, but he clutched Cedric to him even more tightly. He raised his free hand and seized Dumbledore's wrist, while Dumbledore's face swam in and out to focus. "He's back," Harry whispered. "He's back! Voldemort!" One of the most important things, and this is important both experientially, I suppose, for the reader and narratively in the course of this chapter, is how disoriented Harry is and simultaneously how deeply anchored in Harry's POV we are. Objectivity here would necessarily drain this moment of a great deal of drama. See also the end of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, the movie adaptation, right? When we are seeing this from a omniscient third-person perspective, we're getting a very different sense of what is happening, and that forces certain narrative changes into the way that the reveals are handled. We'll talk about that in a couple of weeks when we're ready to talk about the movie. Here, though, because we are anchored in Harry's bewildered and confused and overwhelmed and shocked and pain-stricken state, we can actually take our time with the reveals. The details when they come are fair, are clear, are vibrant, but the inferences are left for the readers, right? What do we know for sure? Well, we know for sure that he is smelling grass. We know for sure that he is turned over. We know for sure that he is seeing the stars and seeing Albus Dumbledore. We know for sure that he is back at the edge of the maze. He could see the stands rising above him, the shapes of people moving in them, the stars above, right? Another echo of the stars there. He is back in a healthier world, a more vibrant world, a living world. And of course, that's powerful metaphorically speaking because of the presence of stars here above the stadium on the Hogwarts school grounds. But more specifically, the grass. He is dragged back from the graveyard into the living world. This portkey transportation that has wrenched him to safety, so it would seem, is also a transformation from literally a world of the dead, not just Voldemort, of course, and not just the Death Eaters too, but the graveyard and its environs. But he has been dragged back to a world of the living. We're getting presence and noise and sound and life, even the scent of the grass, which for those of you who have been following along with me in my recent discussions over in There and Back Again will probably remind you, as it reminds me, of Pippin's last stand right at the end of Book 5, as we're assaulting the Black Gate of Mordor, as we're assaulting the Morannon, and Pippin resolves himself. He steels himself to do his duty in this moment and wishes, just for a beat, that he could feel the clean grass and the hot sun again, that he could have this moment of connection and of life. And of course, there's no sun present here. We're still under the starlit sky, but it's very powerful in exactly that same way. Harry let go of the cup, but he clutched Cedric to him even more tightly. He raised his free hand and seized Dumbledore's wrist while Dumbledore's face swam in and out of focus. "He's back," Harry whispered. "He's back, Voldemort." It is very tempting to try to identify a single turning point in the closing movement of this book, right? Everything from the touching of the Triwizard Cup and the transportation via Portkey to the graveyard at Little Hangleton, it is very tempting to try to identify a single turning point that indicates to us beyond the shadow of a doubt that this is now a different kind of story. And we have some competitors in that regard, right? Obviously, the touching of the Portkey itself, I think, works as a powerful break in the expected progression of the narrative at that point, as we discussed back when we got to the Triwizard Cup. In fact, the death of Cedric Diggory, pretty powerful. The reemergence of Voldemort, the reverse spell effect, the Priori Incantatem effect, the manifestation of Lily and of James and even of Cedric himself, and then the grabbing of the Portkey again and the return to Hogwarts. We're not done, by the way. We're not done drawing lines here. And that, I think, is the most effective part. In our desire to identify a single turning point here at the end of the book, we may be blinded to the fact that what we actually get are a succession of cumulative turning points. Moment after moment after moment takes us another half step forward. Each moment in sequence takes us another half step forward into this different world, into this darker world, into this different kind of story, but each builds on the last. Each is itself a threshold. We get a cascade of threshold sequences here. Harry has been returned to the real world, but he's clutching Cedric's dead body, and he's affixed on the return of Voldemort, right? That's the first thing that he said. He's back, Voldemort. We're not leaving the events of Little Hangleton behind. That was not an episode, and now that minor distraction resolved, we are going to return to our regularly scheduled Harry Potter story, in which Harry is going to be awarded the prize money associated with the Triwizard Tournament and so on. We're not doing that. We are again emphasizing how powerful this transition is and what it means, what it counts for, I suppose. Let me see as I catch up. Yes, Chris saying, "My God, imagine this from Dumbledore's position. Harry desperately grabbing his wrist and whispering that a student dead." God, his worst nightmare, I'm sure, says Chris. I completely agree, Chris. I think this has to be like one of the most important moments in Dumbledore's life. This has to be one of the most defining moments in the history, the modern history at least, of the Wizarding world. I think this is shocking. And when we talked last time about what is happening at Hogwarts, and we're just talking about, a certain amount of fear, a certain amount of trepidation, the release that we get here, the rush that we get here is completely consistent with that, though we are, as I say, crucially anchored in Harry's disoriented experience. A torrent of sound deafened and confused him. There were voices everywhere, footsteps, screams. He remained where he was, his face screwed up against the noise as though it were a nightmare that would pass, screaming as he returns to the real world, obviously associated with the screaming of the Cruciatus curse, right? The screaming that is released as the reverse spell effect takes hold of Voldemort's wand, as the beads of light find their way back into Voldemort's wand. But also, at this point, Harry could be returning to open warfare. He has no idea. This is, and I think this is a missed opportunity in the movie adaptation too. If I were adapting this story, I would be very, very tempted to echo visually and orally at this point in the movie the events of the revelation of the Dark Mark, the Mors Mordre spell back at the Quidditch World Cup. I would be very interested in echoing those two things and having Harry believe for a moment that no, Death Eaters have come to Hogwarts. This is it. It's all falling apart. That suspension would not, I think, be cheap, because it is, in its way, true. They're just the screaming and the rushing of people. These are responses to the manifestation, to the consequence of Voldemort, I suppose, to the influence of Voldemort rather than the actual presence of Voldemort. But it is still one and the same. Yeah. Or are we talking? We're talking about weather and all these lovely people who are having very fine weather in other parts of the country. Yes, it is. I think something like 95 degrees today here in Oklahoma City. Here, the very height, the hottest part of the afternoon, which I'm sure is also accounting for my skin tone not being perhaps all that it should be here in this daylit mid-afternoon session, right? Okay, Marshall asking, how long has it been since Harry and Cedric disappeared? 30 minutes? An hour? It's really powerful to imagine the crowd's growing unease as nobody returns from the maze, save for a dazed Crumb and an injured Fleur. And then finally, Harry emerges cradling Cedric's body. It'd be shocking and confusing and heartbreaking for any onlooker, let alone someone more personally connected to the champions. Yes, the betrayal of Fleur, right? That's the first indication that something has gone very, very wrong. We'll find out about that in the chapters to come. Then Victor emerging once more from the labyrinth, and then nothing, no sound. I would estimate. It's difficult to be sure because of Voldemort's grandstanding, honestly. That is the part of the sequence in Little Hangleton that I have the hardest time kind of plotting chronologically. I'm just not sure how long it takes Voldemort to do the rounds of his Death Eaters and to, afflict many of them with the Cruciatus Curse and to kind of to do that theatrical thing that Voldemort does. I would be inclined to say somewhere between a half hour and an hour, yes, but a significant chunk of time, certainly. And now, what, a flash of light, a rush of air, something to indicate the returning portkey. There have been some thoughts, some speculative thoughts concerning the Triwizard Cup, and perhaps the notion that it was always a portkey, and in fact, seizing the Triwizard Cup was supposed to teleport you back outside of the maze. That part of its function was always true. So perhaps this is not completely unexpected, I suppose. Dumbledore is very nearby, is the thing. We don't know, again, how long Harry is in this confused and overwhelmed state, so we don't know how long it takes Dumbledore to get to him. Not long, presumably. But also it is possible that this was like a designated emergence point for whichever one of the champions was successful here in the third task. I don't know. I'm not sure about the mechanics of the portkey in that regard. I don't know if it's easier to enchant a portkey from nothing, or if it's easier to subvert the portkey charm already placed on an object or an artifact. We are not going to get any account of that later. But yeah, it's fascinating. Yes, origami. Oh, what a fantastic phrase you've got here, origami. This is so good. Yes, it is a comparable act of, in a sense, inadvertent terrorism on Voldemort's part. The series changes here similarly to the real world after that point. That's very, very strong. Inadvertent terrorism. Yes. Not quite accidental terrorism, I suppose, right? Voldemort certainly didn't intend this, but his evil is such that it has these indirectly associated events, and the consequence is the same. That's a really powerful piece of analysis there, origami. Thank you for that. Yeah. Mel is saying, I've always had canon that the cup would portkey the victor to outside the maze. I like that. Given our interest in, our fascination with wizardly theatricality, and given the results of the previous two challenges, and given everyone who is assembled to witnesses, I mean, it is kind of, what is the alternative, right? That's Harry, after another hour of trailing his way back through the labyrinth, is just going to emerge from the entrance to the maze. Sorry, not labyrinth, maze. Apologies, Angela. That he's just going to emerge from the maze, holding the cup, looking a little tired. His robe ripped, a little gash on his cheek or whatever, and that's going to be the moment of victory. No, that doesn't quite sit right for me. That doesn't quite feel right for me. I think the use of the cup as a portkey that will teleport him out, and suddenly Krakoom, there he is, you know, like a mid-80s Walt Simonson on Thor sound effect coming out there. Yeah, I can absolutely see that happening. That would be a very powerful and very theatrical and very kind of sports entertainment kind of moment for everyone who was assembled, which again echoes what we've seen in the Quidditch World Cup too. Okay. That's enough speculation about the mechanics of the Triwizard Tournament, though, because we have to get into our biggest reveal, and we're going to look very closely at this overwhelming rush of sensory information that Harry gets as Moody appears. Someone larger and stronger than he was half pulling, half carrying him through the frightened crowd. Harry heard people gasping, screaming, and shouting as the man supporting him pushed a path through them, taking him back to the castle. Across the lawn, past the lake and the Durmstrang ship, Harry heard nothing but the heavy breathing of the man helping him walk. "What happened, Harry?" the man asked at last as he lifted Harry up the stone steps. Clunk, clunk, clunk. It was Mad-Eye Moody. "Cup was a portkey," said Harry as they crossed the entrance hall. "Took me and Cedric to a graveyard, and Voldemort was there. Lord Voldemort." Clunk, 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 up the marble stairs. "The Dark Lord was there. What happened then?" "Killed Cedric. They killed Cedric. And then," clunk, 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 along the corridor. "Made a potion. Got his body back." "The Dark Lord got his body back. He's returned. And the Death Eaters came, and then we dueled." "You dueled with the Dark Lord?" "Got away. My wand did something funny. I saw my mum and dad. They came out of his wand." "In here, Harry. In here. And sit down. You'll be all right now. Drink this." Harry heard a key scrape in a lock and felt a cup being pushed into his hands. Fragments of sensory information, most of which are immediate and somewhat divorced of context, right? Clunk, clunk, clunk. We know what that clunking sound is as Mad-Eye Moody is carrying Harry back to the castle. We know that is the sound of his artificial leg as he's pacing swiftly through the castle grounds and then through the castle itself. We get the scrape of the key in a lock, the cup being pushed into his hands, but we also get the vision of the lake and the Durmstrang ship. The Durmstrang ship seems to be, well, a super irrelevant detail for Harry to notice at this point, except of course that it isn't, because we're still leaning on the idea that there is a Death Eater at Hogwarts and we don't know who it is. And though it is easy, I think, and though I think we've all kind of had this one, and I now get to jump to the spoiler. Hey, you guys, this is fantastic. It is about time. We've done, 20 sessions here where I've tried to play this a little close to the vest. We now know that Mad-Eye Moody is not in fact Mad-Eye Moody. We now know that Mad-Eye Moody is Bartemius Crouch Jr., that he is Voldemort's loyal Death Eater in Hogwarts. But even at this point, though it is easy to appreciate how this mystery is constructed and the lightness of touch with which we frame out the mystery through the course of the book, thinking in particular, of course, of the sequence with the Marauder's map, it's beautifully done. It's a really nicely structured bit of narrative, particularly from J.K. Rowling, who up until this point has not always demonstrated the most care and dexterity in that specific and particular regard. This is a beautifully constructed bit of misdirection. This is close-up magic, and I absolutely love how it unfolds. But what we must pay attention to is that even in the aftermath of the Voldemort reveal, we are still suspending the Mad-Eye Moody reveal. We're not there yet. And it's sometimes very tempting when you've read this book several times, when you've seen the movie, when you know that the reveal is coming, to just skip ahead to it and to read all of Mad-Eye Moody's dialogue, for example, in this passage, in this sequence, as being proof of the reveal. But the first time that you read the book, I think you get a very different experience. Harry is safe. And we were talking last time about that tremendous delta. Why is the Triwizard Cup a portkey at all? Why is that the way that Voldemort chooses to get Harry to the graveyard in Little Hangleton? Well, in part, I'm sure, partly it's a timing issue. Certainly, I am indebted to many listeners to Dear Mr. Potter for getting in touch and kind of laying out the timeline and speculating that is the reason why, because we need a specific focal point which we can aim at, a temporal focal point for Wormtail and Voldemort, in order to make sure that all the parts of the ritual are ready to go all at the same time. And actually, the climax of the Triwizard Tournament does give them not a unique opportunity to orchestrate all of this, but a very powerful and compelling opportunity to orchestrate all of this. So that's one side, right? But the other side of that is the delta between Harry's triumph as the victor, as the emergent champion of the Triwizard Tournament, and then his death at the hands of Voldemort. That descent from joy and victory into utter despair and ruination and death, that does seem as though it's the kind of thing that would please Voldemort. But now we're getting a similar thing too. Harry's being taken by Mad-Eye Moody. He's being taken by the only person but Albus Dumbledore that has been proved completely trustworthy throughout the course of Goblet of Fire. That is what is happening right now. We know that everything's going to be okay, We might be expecting an assault. We might be expecting an attack. That's certainly my reading of the reference, the specific reference to the Durmstrang ship there, right? We're coming across the lawn, past the lake in the Durmstrang ship. Harry heard nothing but the heavy breathing of the man helping him walk. Helping him walk? Okay, there's the Durmstrang ship. That is external. That is the foe. Here is Mad-Eye Moody helping me walk. I've got his breathing. It's intimate and it's personal and it's connected in a very powerful way. So the reveal when it comes is all the more devastating, I think, because of that. Yeah, Half-Blood Muggle saying here, I wish I could reread this book for the first time. The Moody reveal was just so unexpected when I was 10. Yeah, I had, unfortunately, coming a little later to Harry Potter than most people, a little later, I had the Moody reveal spoiled for me to the degree that I knew Mad-Eye Moody was not Mad-Eye Moody, basically, coming into this book for the first time. But I didn't know quite the mechanic of that, and I did not guess the Barty Crouch name association the first time that I was reading the book. But it is still very, very powerful. Yeah, good. So there's Mad-Eye Moody. Let's get to the confession, shall we? This obviously I can't pull this entire chapter. That would be hours of our lives as we go through everything. So I've just pulled the most relevant and compelling parts of this confession. Who put your name in the Goblet of Fire under the name of a different school? I did. Who frightened off every person I thought might try to hurt you or prevent you from winning the tournament? I did. Who nudged Hagrid into showing you the dragons? I did. Who helped you to see the only way you could beat the dragon? I did. Moody's magical eye had now left the door. It was fixed upon Harry. His lopsided mouth leered more widely than ever. It hasn't been easy, Harry, guiding you through these tasks without arousing suspicion. I've had to use every ounce of cunning I possess so that my hand would not be detectable in your success. Dumbledore would have been very suspicious if you'd managed everything too easily. As long as you got into that maze, preferably with a decent head start, then I knew I would have a chance of getting rid of the other champions and leaving your way clear. But I also had to contend with your stupidity. The second task. That was when I was most afraid you would fail. I was keeping watch on you, Potter. I knew you hadn't worked out the egg's clue, so I had to give you another hint. You didn't, Harry said hoarsely. Cedric gave me the clue. Who told Cedric how to open it underwater? I did. I trusted he would pass the information on to you. Decent people are so easy to manipulate, Potter. I was sure Cedric would want to repay you for telling him about the dragons, and so he did. But even then, Potter, you seemed likely to fail. I was watching you all the time, all those hours in the library. Didn't you realize the book you needed was in your dormitory all along? I planted it there early on. I gave it to the Longbottom boy, don't you remember? Magical water plants of the Mediterranean. It would have told you all you needed to know about gillyweed. I expected you to ask everyone and anyone you could for help. Longbottom would have told you in an instant, but you did not. You did not. You have a streak of pride and independence that might have ruined all. So what could I do? Feed you information from another innocent source. You told me at the Yule Ball a house elf called Dobby had given you a Christmas present. I called the elf to the staff room to collect some robes for cleaning. I staged a loud conversation with Professor McGonagall about the hostages who'd been taken and whether Potter would think to use gillyweed. And your little elf friend ran straight to Snape's office and then hurried to find you. It's obviously an inescapable temptation to continue to read Mad-Eye Moody's in Mad-Eye Moody's voice, what I have come to think of as Mad-Eye Moody's voice. I'm happy to go with the evolution of the Polyjuice Potion here. I don't think that we have to account for a great Mad-Eye Moody impersonation from Bartemius Crouch. It seems to be that is a consequential effect of the Polyjuice Potion too. But look at this dialogue. Look at the way that it is actually written on the page. Ignore the accent of Mad-Eye Moody. This is completely unlike any other dialogue we get from Moody in the course of the entire book. Barty Crouch Jr. may not have had a particular gift for voices, right? We can credit that to the magic, but he had a fantastic gift for distinguishing his own natural voice from Mad-Eye Moody's. Alistair Moody's voice is one of the most clear and distinct that we get, I would argue, in the entire Harry Potter series. I don't think anyone else talks like Alistair Moody in the entire... Maybe what? Hagrid stands out. Minerva McGonagall stands out, certainly. I'm not even sure that Dumbledore stands out that much. I think that Mad-Eye Moody has an enormously distinct voice, and the control that J.K. Rowling demonstrates in the provision of attributed dialogue for Moody, and then the way that she breaks that hard here, it's completely distinct. It hasn't been easy, Harry, guiding you through these tasks without arousing suspicion. That is just not a sentence that Alistair Moody would say. It's very strong. It's a beautiful thing. Yeah. Stop monologuing. You're lousing up your own plan, says Becca. Yeah. You know what? We've kind of got to credit Barty Crouch with a certain lack of genre awareness, I suppose, at this point. Yes, he is absolutely monologuing. He is absolutely laying out all of the exposition. It is great dialogue, and I enjoy it very much. In general, in fact, let me just kind of give J.K. Rowling a pass in this regard. In general, I like all of her villain monologues. It's not that villains ought to monologue, and it's not that there isn't a better way of offering this exposition to the reader. I just really like the way that she writes grandstanding villains. That is true in every book in the series. I just adore the way that this unfolds. And we see, as we may have inferred before, the proof of Mad Eye Moody's ongoing intervention into Harry's experience, right? The provision of the magical plants of the Mediterranean book to Neville Longbottom. You remember how that whole thing is framed out, how he disturbs Neville in the course of the class through the use of the unforgivable curses. He shakes Neville to his core, and then in a completely unique moment of interaction between Mad Eye Moody and any of the students in Hogwarts, apparently takes Neville back to his office and calms him down and gives him a book just to soothe his spirits, thereby planting the idea. Harry, of course, does not go to Neville for help with the second task because he is not supposed to get help from the other students of Hogwarts. This is still when we are observing the letter and the spirit of the law, I suppose, regarding the Triwizard Tournament. I think that this beat would have been a little more powerful if we hadn't so systematically deconstructed the structures surrounding the Triwizard Tournament as we approach the third task. I'm not ever entirely sure what it is that J.K. Rowling is getting at that point, except that we need narratively to inject some suspended drama regarding the Triwizard Tournament, but I think that there are other ways of accomplishing that, and this reveal would have worked all the better if the rules surrounding intervention were even more strict, or actually not even more strict, just as strict as they were when they were introduced to us way earlier in the book. So we get the beat, the great unresolved beat, right? The unanswered question. Who told Cedric about the egg? Well, of course, Mad Eye Moody told Cedric about the egg. And Cedric, because he was decent and because decent people are so easy to manipulate, Potter, because of Cedric's underlying decency, a virtue that we've discussed extensively over the course of the last few weeks here in Dear Mr. Potter, Cedric did in fact share the information with Harry, and that led to, well, not actually Harry's best chance, right? Harry was no closer to solving the second task or coming up with a plan for the second task after learning about the stakes and circumstances of the second task. But luckily, Mad Eye Moody is able to manipulate Dobby into getting him the Gillyweed, which is pretty great. Marshall Moore saying, all the monologues make me think that as much as this series is a combination boarding school adventure story, fantasy adventure, the structure is often a lot closer to a whodunit mystery. There always is a reveal at the end, even though it's more often the villain revealing the plot than Harry Poirot, I guess is what we're going for there, Marshall. Harry Poirot explaining it. Yeah, Harry Poirot is actually a very good crossover series. I would be very into that. Yes, you're absolutely right. J.K. Rowling loves... That is actually oftentimes a common feature of the boarding school adventure, particularly if you look at those points at which the boarding school adventure kind of intersects with juvenile mystery fiction. There is oftentimes a core mystery that demands the attention. This is less true of like your original boarding school adventure, The Adventures of Just William and so on and so forth. But by the time we get to the middle of the 20th century and we're getting Enid Blyton's Famous Five and Secret Seven and stories like that, by the time we're getting to Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys on this side of the Atlantic, we're getting very mystery-oriented boarding school and juvenile experience adventure stories that do generally rest upon that turn, do generally rest upon that mystery story climax. It is one of the most interesting applications of mystery structure. Mystery structure is not generally very flexible, right? Like mystery structure is a pretty demanding and rigorous kind of narrative structure that behaves unlike most other common narrative structures, right? It's not an adventure plot. It's not a thriller plot. It is something much more intellectual and much more defined and definite, to draw a very fine distinction between those two ideas. And yet it has found a natural home here in boarding school adventure. And as you observe, fantasy series too. Yeah. Good. Oh, Marshall's asking, can we do a brief series on The Cuckoo's Calling and its sequels? I've only read The Cuckoo's Calling, and everything that I'm saying about J.K. Rowling actually constructing a very nice mystery at the heart of this story. Yeah, she's going to go on to do more of that. Actually, I think The Cuckoo's Calling It is not, in fairness, it is not what I want. It is not a book that is written for me, but it is a book very much that I can appreciate. I think it is a well-written piece of fiction, and I think that it is a well-crafted mystery. It would be very interesting, actually, to go and look at that. Yeah. Good, okay. So that is our confession. Boy, we just get a ton of confession. Mad-Eye Moody has been behind everything. Turns out it wasn't Ludo Bagman after all. Turns out it wasn't Karkaroff after all. Turns out it wasn't Snape after all. It was a hidden Death Eater here in the faculty of Hogwarts. Let's get to the confrontation, though, when Dumbledore pulls out Stupefy. Stupefy! There was a blinding flash of red light, and with a great splintering and crashing, the door of Moody's office was blasted apart. Moody was thrown backward onto the office floor. Harry, still staring at the place where Moody's face had been, saw Albus Dumbledore, Professor Snape, and Professor McGonagall looking back at him out of the faux glass. He looked around and saw the three of them standing in the doorway, Dumbledore in front, his wand outstretched. At that moment, Harry fully understood for the first time why people said Dumbledore was the only wizard Voldemort had ever feared. The look upon Dumbledore's face as he stared down at the unconscious form of Mad-Eye Moody was more terrible than Harry could ever have imagined. There was no benign smile upon Dumbledore's face, no twinkle in the eyes behind the spectacles. There was cold fury in every line of the ancient face. A sense of power radiated from Dumbledore as though he were giving off a burning heat. He stepped into the office, placed a foot underneath Moody's unconscious body, and kicked him over onto his back so that his face was visible. Snape followed him, looking into the faux glass where his own face was still visible, glaring into the room. Professor McGonagall went straight to Harry. "Come along, Potter," she whispered. The thin line of her mouth was twitching as though she were about to cry. "Come along. Hospital wing." "No," said Dumbledore sharply. "Dumbledore, he ought to... Look at him. He's been through enough tonight." "He will stay, Minerva, because he needs to understand," said Dumbledore curtly. "Understanding is the first step to acceptance, and only with acceptance can there be recovery. He needs to know who has put him through this ordeal, through the ordeal he has suffered tonight, and why." "Moody," Harry said. He was still in a state of complete disbelief. "How could it have been Moody?" "This is not Alistair Moody," said Dumbledore quietly. "You have never known Alistair Moody. The real Moody would not have removed you from my sight after what happened tonight. The moment he took you, I knew, and I followed." Okay. Obviously, yes, Half-Blood Muggle calling out here. This is so fantastic, right? Half-Blood Muggle calling out here in the chat. I love the few moments of Dumbledore's power and fury in the books. The scene, the order scene in his office with Marietta and Harry. Yes. Anytime that glint comes through, there are always such great moments. I completely agree. And Elizabeth, who is joining us in the chat, powerful Dumbledore always gives me chills. Amazing. And by contrast, Brian pointing out, maternal Minerva breaks my heart. We are getting some really strong characterization in this sequence. This is so powerful. I do want to note, just so that we can observe this and set it aside, because it is crucially important, but it's also perhaps the least obvious and striking detail of this unfolding scene, the faux glass. The appearance of Severus Snape in the faux glass, alongside Albus Dumbledore and Minerva McGonagall. You will note, too, that Snape does not speak through this section of the book, which is a very strong choice, actually, because it would be difficult to have Snape speak and still maintain his character, this dual alignment and internally conflicted character at this point. But Snape's presence, and particularly his appearance in the faux glass too, that's why we call it out there again, right? That's why we have the second beat of the faux glass. We are now assured that Snape is on our side, whatever our side might mean in this instance. We're going to get to the passing out of instructions in just a moment, but yes. He looked around and saw the three of them standing in the doorway. Dumbledore in front, his wand outstretched. So first, stupefied, the shattering of the door and the casting back of Mad-Eye Moody, right? The knocking unconscious of Mad-Eye Moody. This is an incredibly powerful spell effect. So we've seen this manifestation of genuinely top-tier magic, but that is not what arrests Harry's attention. At that moment, Harry fully understood for the first time why people said Dumbledore was the only wizard Voldemort had ever feared. The look upon Dumbledore's face as he stared down at the unconscious form of Mad-Eye Moody was more terrible than Harry could have ever imagined. There was no benign smile upon Dumbledore's face, no twinkle in the eyes behind the spectacles. There was cold fury in every line of that ancient face. A sense of power radiated from Dumbledore as though he were giving off burning heat. Again, for those of you who've been following along with There and Back Again, this is very close to some descriptions that we get of Gandalf, uncloaked, Gandalf the White, Gandalf in moments of his greatest and most manifest power, right? Facing off against the Balrog, still Gandalf the Grey, facing off against the Balrog in Khazad-dûm, facing off against Saruman on the steps of Orthanc at Isengard. There are moments when great characters in the works of Professor Tolkien uncloak themselves and are revealed, right? We can think of the Fellowship passing the Argonath when Frodo looks back in the boat and there sits Aragorn, only it's not Aragorn, it's Aragorn, son of Arathorn, heir of Isildur, you know, the returning king. We just get these moments where characters are not different, but they are just revealed, and this is the first time that we have seen Dumbledore thus revealed. And yet, as Harry observes, this isn't inconsistent. We've talked several times, even here within the frame of Goblet of Fire, about that opening scene back in Philosopher's Stone when Minerva McGonagall talks to Dumbledore about what distinguishes him from Voldemort. What distinguishes Dumbledore from Voldemort? There are some things that Dumbledore will not do. There are some lines that he will not cross. And apparently, we're in a more nebulous space right now. Apparently, we're in a space where Dumbledore is at least thinking of crossing those lines, or is at least capable of crossing those lines. Harry fully understood for the first time why people said that Dumbledore was the only wizard Voldemort had ever feared. That fear absolutely consistent with the grandstanding theatrical Voldemort that we got in last week's reading when he's talking about Hogwarts, when he's talking about Harry being under the protection of Albus Dumbledore. And oh, really? He's under the protection of another wizard? Why is that a problem with your massed army of Death Eaters? Why not just be resurrected, assemble an army, and go to Hogwarts? Remember, because Wormtail does say that the blood of any foe, brackets, pretty much any wizard who isn't a Death Eater, would have resurrected Voldemort. Now, Voldemort believes that Harry Potter's blood specifically is going to raise him to an equal or even greater power. But he could have come back. He could have regained his body, marshaled an army of Death Eaters, and marched on Hogwarts theoretically, that is a thing that could happen in the Harry Potter universe. But he doesn't, because he is still afraid of Albus Dumbledore. That rivalry, that jealousy, that again, resonance between the two of them, that is something that is clearly very important to Voldemort. In what way does Harry understand? Why is it that Harry apprehends Dumbledore's power and terrible magnificence, I suppose, in this moment? The look upon Dumbledore's face as he the look upon Dumbledore's face as he stared down at the unconscious form of Mad-Eye Moody was more terrible than Harry could have imagined. That's the raw assertion. It is more terrible than Harry could have imagined. Why is it more terrible? In what way is it more terrible? Well, there was no benign smile upon Dumbledore's face, no twinkle in the eyes behind his spectacles. Okay, so these are two tokens of civility and gentility and affability and even a kind of jovial harmlessness that we have come to associate with Dumbledore from literally his first appearance in the book, right? The first appearance, the little cigarette lighter that pulls the streetlights out of Privet Drive. Like, this is pretty silly. This is pretty jovial. This is pretty innocent. That is the thing that we associate with Dumbledore. That innocence in particular, right? The childlike innocence is something that we associate with Dumbledore in particular. So there's no benign smile, no twinkle in the eyes. There was instead cold fury in every line of the ancient face, a sense of power radiated from Dumbledore as though he were giving off burning heat. Yeah, this is Dumbledore uncloaked. This is Dumbledore in his power and in his magnificence. Origami saying, I'm very into badass Dumbledore. He truly is terrifying here. The sudden juxtaposition really exemplifies how frightening this is. And it's not just it's not just Harry's apprehension of Dumbledore, his discernment of Dumbledore's, well, okay, hesitating there, I want to qualify this a little bit. I was going to say his discernment of Dumbledore's true nature. I'm not sure that is true, but his understanding of all that Dumbledore is. Dumbledore may not be just this, and that is not to suggest that affable, jovial, lemon drop Dumbledore is in any way inauthentic, but he is at the very least this too. That for me isn't even the most distressing and disturbing part. It's McGonagall. He stepped into the office, placed a foot under Moody's unconscious body and kicked him over onto his back so that his face was visible. Snape followed him, looking into the faux glass. That's our second beat with the faux glass, confirming where his own face was still visible, glaring into the room. Just really lampshading that. Yes, Snape is visible in the faux glass. He is an enemy of Mad-Eye Moody, or whoever it is that Mad-Eye Moody is going to turn out to be. He is resolutely one of the good guys. We just need to dispense with that ambiguity here because we need to move into the next part of the story. We need to draw that line very clearly and very firmly. Professor McGonagall went straight to Harry. "Come along, Potter," she whispered. The thin line of her mouth was twitching as though she were about to cry. "Come along, hospital wing." So not only is she on the brink of being overwhelmed by her emotions, Minerva McGonagall, of all people, on the brink of being overwhelmed by her emotions, but look at the attributed dialogue. "Come along, Potter. Come along, hospital wing." not fully formed sentences, not even complete thoughts, just fragments. She is holding on by her fingernails at this point. Why is she holding on by her fingernails? Well, the betrayal of Mad Eye Moody, or whoever this is that is purporting to be Mad Eye Moody, I suppose, is very significant. The thought of agent of Voldemort here in the bosom of Hogwarts, the return of Voldemort in the first place, of course, but also I read this as a consequence of Dumbledore's fullest manifestation of his power here. This raw Dumbledore is enough to shake Minerva McGonagall to her core. And that's something that we don't do lightly, narratively speaking. And then, of course, Dumbledore's response is, again, pay close attention to the attributed dialogue. Pay close attention to the way that these characters speak in this moment. It is one thing for Minerva McGonagall to come along, hospital wing, and quite another for Dumbledore to just say, no, said Dumbledore sharply. Dumbledore, he ought to, look at him. He's been through enough tonight, right? We're getting still fragmented dialogue from Minerva McGonagall, which is pretty much completely unprecedented. He will stay, Minerva, because he needs to understand, said Dumbledore curtly. Sharply? Curtly? These are not words that we associate with Albus Dumbledore. He is in this powerful, yes, but very austere space. And we can feel, I think, or do feel here a little intimidated at this point. Yeah. Kristen saying, I always interpreted the faux glass not to be so much about physical proximity, but about the proximity of an attack. Faux glass would presumably just be the proximity of enemies, right? The close physical proximity of enemies. The shadowy shapes who are moving around in the faux glass, which we took, I suppose, back in our introduction to the faux glass to be Death Eaters out there in the world, like they're just shadows. No, I think that's probably just Albus Dumbledore like 5 feet away. I think that's, or maybe it is only made manifest by Dumbledore's awareness of Barty Crouch's masquerade here. Again, we can speculate. We can speculate about the, yes, somebody's silhouettes were always there, says C-Star. Yes, yeah, good. All right. This is not Alistair Moody, said Dumbledore quietly. You have never known Alistair Moody. The real Moody would not have removed you from my side after what happened tonight. The moment he took you, I knew and I followed. Hey, you guys, this is not Alistair Moody. Well, who is it then? Let's find out by moving on. Severus, please fetch me the strongest truth potion you possess, and then go down to the kitchens and bring up the house elf called Winky. Minerva, kindly go to Hagrid's house where you will find a large black dog sitting in the pumpkin patch. Take the dog up to my office. Tell him I will be with him shortly, then come back here. If either Snape or McGonagall found these instructions peculiar, they hid their confusion. Both turned at once and left the office. Dumbledore walked over to the trunk with 7 locks, fitted the first key in the lock, and opened it. It contained a mass of spellbooks. Dumbledore closed the trunk, placed a second key in the second lock, and opened the trunk again. The spellbooks had vanished. This time it contained an assortment of broken sneakoscopes, some parchment and quills, and what looked like a silvery invisibility cloak. Harry watched, astounded, as Dumbledore placed the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th keys in their respective locks, reopening the trunk and each time revealing different contents. Then he placed the 7th key in the lock, threw open the lid, and Harry let out a cry of amazement. He was looking down into a kind of pit, an underground room, and lying on the floor some 10 feet below, apparently fast asleep, thin and starved in appearance, was the real Mad Eye Moody. His wooden leg was gone. The socket that should have held his magical eye looked empty beneath its lid, and chunks of his grizzled hair were missing. Harry stared, thunderstruck, between the sleeping Moody in the trunk and the unconscious Moody lying on the floor of the office. Dumbledore climbed into the trunk, lowered himself, and fell lightly on the floor beside the sleeping Moody. He bent over him. Stunned, controlled by the Imperious curse, very weak, he said. Of course, they would have needed to keep him alive. Harry, throw down the impostor's cloak. He's freezing. Madame Pomfrey will need to see him, but he seems in no immediate danger. It is one thing to assert that that was not the real Mad Eye Moody on the floor of his office. It is quite another to uncover the real Mad Eye Moody. The use of the trunk as a gateway device here is genuinely lovely and genuinely magical. This is one of those bag of holding moments, just because apparently we can't go more than a few pages in modern Harry Potter without making a D&D reference. But this is one of those bag of holding moments that always feels genuinely magical to me. I love how this works. The trunk opening and revealing different contents too also speaks, again, another element of the British fantasy tradition with which J.K. Rowling was apparently unfamiliar, but there is a certain association between this trunk and the luggage from Terry Pratchett's Discworld series, which is very lovely. If you haven't read the Discworld series, you definitely should. We also get An assortment of broken sneakoscopes, some parchment and quills, and what looked like a silvery invisibility cloak. Obviously, the invisibility cloak is going to be extremely necessary in explaining the function of the plot, the movement of the plot later. Turns out there's just another one of them. But the broken sneakoscopes, that's a lovely detail because, of course, Mad-Eye Moody would have gone around the castle, assembled all the sneakoscopes that he could find, and shattered them because they would have revealed his purpose here, too. It's very Mary Poppins, says Marshall Moore. Yes, exactly. And C-Star pointing out, I want a 7-in-1 trunk. A Discworld luggage would be better, though, especially since it would eat anyone who tried to lock me in or otherwise harm me. Plus, it has those hundreds of little legs, so it can just follow you around, too. Is that better? I'm not sure that that's better, actually, now that I think about it. But yes. So we get the resolution of the real Mad-Eye Moody. Oh, I also wanted to note the tasks here. Severus, please fetch me the strongest truth potion you possess, then go down to the kitchens and bring up the house elf called Winky. Again, the first time that I read this book, I was convinced that Veritaserum was not a real thing. That was why it didn't show up in Dumbledore's pensive memories of the various trials that took place after the First Wizarding War. That's why it hasn't been put to any greater purpose in the first 3 books of the series. I feel like Veritaserum could be used all the time. We will find out later, of course. It will be retconned that Veritaserum is actually very hard to produce, but also very effective in very small quantities. So who can say for sure? But yes, Veritaserum is real. That's why it's the title of the chapter. That's why Severus Snape is dispatched to go and fetch it right now, along with Winky. Minerva, kindly go down to Hagrid's house where you will find a large black dog sitting in the pumpkin patch. Take the dog up to my office. Tell him I will be with him shortly, then come back here, which is just a beat that I love. I genuinely want the sequence of Minerva McGonagall going out to the pumpkin patch, finding Sirius Black and saying, well, Hagrid says that he'll be back soon. It's very lovely. If either Snape or McGonagall found these instructions peculiar, they hid their confusion, both turned at once and left the office. Again, not unusual for Minerva McGonagall. Well, maybe a little unusual given the severity with which Dumbledore has just treated her, or at least the severity with which he has just spoken to her. But Snape obedient in this moment. Again, another powerful beat of restoration for our... Well, a restoration of our trust in Severus Snape, as though we ever possessed such a thing. A powerful affirmation of Dumbledore's trust in Severus Snape. I'll put it that way. Yes, good. As I catch up. Oh, Julia's saying I prefer Hermione's handbag, to be honest. Yeah, okay, that's actually better. That's better. Half-Blood Muggle saying, hello, dog, please go to Dumble's office. Okay, Dumble's, now what? Yeah, tell him I'll be with him shortly, says it don't connect. Poor Minerva had to be so confused. I'm not sure that's the weirdest instruction that Dumbledore has ever given Minerva McGonagall, and I wonder to what degree... I honestly had never thought about this until literally, what time is it now? It's 3:15 here in Oklahoma City. It was perhaps 2 hours ago that I first wondered about this beat. Is he preserving the secret of Sirius Black's identity for Minerva McGonagall's benefit or for Snape's benefit? I think it might just be for Snape's benefit. I think it might just be, you will find a large black dog sitting in the pumpkin patch. Implicit wink. You know who that large black dog is, though, Minerva, don't you? Take the dog, wink, up to my office and tell him I will be with him shortly, then come back here. I think we may just be preserving Snape's innocence because obviously or Snape's ignorance, I should say, because we'll get to that reveal in just a moment. And now I'm looking at the time and I'm looking at my slide list and I'm trying to figure out where is a good place to stop. Let's do, at the very least, we'll do Veritaserum and maybe we'll get to the plan too. So, Barty Crouch is revealed. He is given the Veritaserum. He gives us all of the exposition about what has happened. This is complex. I know for some readers, this sequence really bogs down. The pacing of this sequence really slows their appreciation. But once again, I am engaged by J.K. Rowling's exposition because of the care with which the dialogue is crafted. I love how distinct Barty Crouch's dialogue is. I love how it is formed. I love... Okay. I know that the performance in the movie is one of the more divisive things that we get in the entire Harry Potter cinematic canon. I know that there are people who absolutely love that performance, and there are people who don't love it at all, who find it completely overblown. I swing back and forth. Right now, I'm in a phase where I'm actually quite enjoying it, but it doesn't have the care and the precision, I would argue, of Barty Crouch Jr.'s dialogue here. Crouch took a deep, shuddering breath, then began to speak in a flat, expressionless voice. My mother saved me. She knew she was dying. She persuaded my father to rescue me as a last favor to her. He loved her as he had never loved me. He agreed. They came to visit me. They gave me a draught of polyjuice potion containing one of my mother's hairs. She took a draught of polyjuice potion containing one of my hairs. We took on each other's appearance. Winky was shaking her head, trembling. Say no more, Master Barty. Say no more. You is getting your father into trouble. But Crouch took another deep breath and continued in the same flat voice. The Dementors are blind. They sensed one healthy, one dying person entering Azkaban. They sensed one healthy, one dying person leaving it. My father smuggled me out, disguised as my mother, in case any prisoners were watching through their doors. My mother died a short while afterward in Azkaban. She was careful to drink Polyjuice Potion until the end. She was buried under my name and bearing my appearance. Everyone believed her to be me. The man's eyelids flickered. "And what did your father do with you when he got you home?" said Dumbledore quietly. "Staged my mother's death. A quiet, private funeral. That grave is empty. The house elf nursed me back to health. Then I had to be concealed. I had to be controlled. My father had to use a number of spells to subdue me. When I had recovered my strength, I thought only of finding my master, of returning to his service." That gorgeous and artful and painstaking construction of the dialogue gets me every single time. They gave me a draft of Polyjuice Potion containing one of my mother's hairs. She took a draft of Polyjuice Potion containing one of my hairs. The Dementors are blind. They sensed one healthy, one dying person entering Azkaban. They sensed one healthy, one dying person leaving it. That repetition, that partial repetition, that conformity to a kind of soulless and expressionless observation and recitation of fact gets me every time. I love how mechanical and how mechanistic it is. Again, to kind of draw that very clean distinction. Lynn is saying, "I never quite understood how the real Moody could have been continuously subdued by the Imperious Curse, being as paranoid and an old battle-hardened auror that he is." Yeah, the duration of the Imperious Curse is interesting. Certainly, I'm thinking of I guess it's not actually a memory in the Pensive. It's Sirius's account of the Death Eaters facing trial in the wake of the First Wizarding War, right? And Avery, who we don't know at that point, apparently claims that he had been under the influence of the Imperious Curse for the entire duration of Voldemort's tyranny, I guess, for the entire duration of Voldemort's power in Britain at the time. We don't quite know the limits of the Imperious Curse, but it does seem likely that the Imperious Curse can manifest an effect over an extended period. Now, that may be a continual presence, as it were, right? That may be that there is a connection between the caster of the Imperious Curse and the recipient, the target, the victim of the Imperious Curse. It may be that there is just an ongoing kind of telepathic or quasi-telepathic connection between the two of them. Or it may be that when Imperio is cast, that whatever geas is laid upon the target, whatever injunction is laid upon the victim, just continues to work presently until it is revoked. That does seem to be a likely possibility. But yeah. Good. Let me catch up here. Yes, C-Star pulling out one of my favorite little details there. How did Dumbledore detect that the real Moody was Imperious at that moment? Dumbledore is very, very good at his job. He is very, very good at being a wizard, is the thing. And yeah, I like that manifestation of power. I'm not inclined to question it because of Dumbledore's, because of two things. Because of his greatness, yes, and also because of his natural authority. I think that in that moment, it plays out pretty well for me. Yeah, good. Yeah, as Marshall says, Dumbles is great at being a wizard, less great at running a school. Is he less great at running a school? Oh boy, I feel like we could spend a couple hours just talking about this, couldn't we? How good is Albus Dumbledore as a headmaster? Well, what is his purpose in running Hogwarts? What is his desire? What is the goal to which he is working toward? Is it the provision of a completely safe and consistent educational environment for the next generation of young wizards and witches, brackets, as we might expect it to be? Well, no, clearly not, right? That is clearly not what he's doing. There's very little about Hogwarts that speaks to consistency and to continuity, and almost nothing at all that speaks to the safety of the student body. And he also manages to lead Hogwarts, to rule Hogwarts with a certain amount of caprice and whimsy, I suppose, with a certain amount of self-indulgence. We all remember how outraged we are at the end of Philosopher's Stone when he just completely throws the house cup out of the window. Just let's not even bother with the formality of the house cup. I'm giving it not just to Gryffindor, but actually specifically to Harry. Harry, here is your cup. This is going to be the last, cup that you'll hold for a couple of years, and the next time you touch a cup, it's not going to work out great for you, but don't worry about that so much right now. But if that is Dumbledore's plan, if that is his intent, if that is his duty, if that is his purpose, then yes, he is not a great headmaster of Hogwarts School. However, if his purpose is to actually train the next generation of witches and wizards, not in a simple academic sense, not in a simple educational sense, but rather in a broader sense, then I'm not sure that Hogwarts is as bad as it may superficially appear to be. I think that Dumbledore has preserved Hogwarts as a bastion of goodness and of truth and of virtue in a wizarding world that, if it ever really escaped the shadow of the First Wizarding War, has certainly been falling back under that shadow for quite some time. See all of our previous discussions about corruption and about bureaucracy and about the observation of the status quo, the perpetuation of the status quo in the wizarding world, the changing relationships with muggles, the rampant racism that afflicts the wizarding world, right? And I'm not just talking about, wizards versus muggles versus muggle-born wizards. I'm not just talking about that distinction, but yeah, the domination of house elves and the casual dismissal of, centaur culture and merfolk culture and goblin culture for that matter too. Yeah, we could definitely talk about this a lot. We'll have a better opportunity still to talk about Dumbledore in the books to come. I'm going to say no more than that for right now. Yeah, good. Okay, so let's do one more slide. And we'll get to the plan, and then we'll get to the details. So this is the coming of Voldemort to the Crouch estate. He arrived at our house late one night in the arms of his servant, Wormtail. My master had found out I was still alive. He had captured Bertha Jorkins in Albania. He had tortured her. She told him a great deal. She told him about the Triwizard Tournament. She told him the old aura Moody was going to teach at Hogwarts. He tortured her until he broke through the memory charm my father had placed upon her. She told him I had escaped from Azkaban. She told him my father kept me imprisoned to prevent me from seeking my master. And so my master knew I was still his faithful servant, perhaps the most faithful of all. My master conceived a plan based upon the information Bertha had given him. He needed me. He arrived at our house near midnight. My father answered the door. The smile spread wide over Crouch's face as though recalling the sweetest memory of his life. Winky's petrified brown eyes were visible through her fingers. She seemed too appalled to speak. It was very quick. My father was placed under the imperious curse by my master. Now my father was the one imprisoned. Controlled. My master forced him to go about his business as usual, to act as though nothing was wrong, and I was released. I awoke. I was myself again, alive as I hadn't been in years. And what did Lord Voldemort ask you to do? Said Dumbledore. He asked me whether I was ready to risk everything for him. I was ready. It was my dream, my greatest ambition to serve him, to prove myself to him. He told me he needed to place a faithful servant at Hogwarts, a servant who would guide Harry Potter through the Triwizard Tournament without appearing to do so, a servant who would watch over Harry Potter, ensure he reached the Triwizard Cup, turn the cup into a portkey, which would take the first person to touch it to my master. But first, you needed Alastor Moody, said Dumbledore. His blue eyes were blazing, though his voice remained calm. Again, evil as its own reward within the frame of Harry Potter. It's disturbing and compelling to think of this imprisonment. And of course, we must bear in mind the relationship between Barty Crouch and his son. The switcheroo at Azkaban is not demonstration of the elder Crouch's virtue or repentance, or the younger Crouch's hope for redemption. You'll remember, of course, during the pensive memory that he protests, in fact, that he had nothing to do with Voldemort, that he was not a Death Eater, that he was not associated with Voldemort. He protested to his father that this was completely unjust, eliciting our sympathy as readers, certainly eliciting Harry's sympathy as a witness to these events via the pensive. Turns out that was a complete lie. Turns out that there is no account given of a later turn to Voldemort. He was a faithful servant of Voldemort even at that moment. Barty Crouch Jr. was more than capable of being manipulative, even, well, very shortly after the fall of Voldemort in the first place. So we get the switcheroo in Azkaban. That is why Barty Crouch Jr. dies in Azkaban. He actually doesn't. His mother dies in Azkaban after being transformed by the Polyjuice Potion. The effects of the Polyjuice Potion linger after death? Well, perhaps not, because the Dementors are blind. So they wouldn't necessarily know and would not necessarily be able to identify or to distinguish between two dead human bodies. there are human guards at Azkaban sometimes. Like there is an accounting given of other guards at Azkaban, but we're leaning away from that idea now. We're kind of retconning Azkaban to being the sole domain of the Dementors, which makes things a little different. You know, obviously we're going to talk about the Dementors in the very next chapter, which I do not think we are going to get to this week. My master conceived a plan based upon the information Bertha had given him. He needed me. He arrived at our house near midnight. My father answered the door, and then the smile that is so horrifying. For him to smile like this under the Veritaserum charm, right? He has been expressionless up until this point, but now the smile comes through anyway. My father was placed under the imperious curse by my master. Now my father was the one imprisoned, controlled. My master forced him to go about his business as usual, to act as though nothing was wrong, and I was released. I awoke. I was myself again, alive as I hadn't been in years. Oh, you have also returned from a kind of death, a kind of non-personhood. No wonder there is such a powerful connection between Barty Crouch and Voldemort, too. Of course, we'll get to this smile, says Gildarts Winters with a little smile emoji. I'm a little horrified because now that's all I can see. I can just see that little yellow round smiley icon. Yes, that's horrifying. That's horrifying, and I don't want to think about it anymore. All right, guys, I am terribly sorry to do this, but I'm afraid I have a very hard out at 3:30, and we are just a minute away from that. So let's call it quits there. We actually made some good progress. That does leave us with a fair number of slides to get through. I didn't think we would make it through all of chapter 36. We have not made it through all of chapter 35, but we can do a special extended edition of Dear Mr. Potter next week. That will be next Tuesday evening. That is Tuesday, June the 6th, 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central. We're going to finish Goblet of Fire. That's pretty much where we are. We're just going to power through, do all that we can to get through to the end of the book. And then, as I say, I'm going to take a week off, and then we'll come back to talk about the movie the following week. This has been an absolute pleasure. As I say, I'm sorry that this is just a slightly shorter session than usual. Thank you all so much for joining me here in this afternoon session. We will, we're going to be in evening sessions for a couple of weeks, but I will do my level best to make sure that we can have more of these Europe-friendly sessions in the weeks to come, because it's just so lovely to have new faces and old faces too, all mixed in together. If there were a single time slot that I could pick for Dear Mr. Potter that would satisfy everyone, for which everyone would be able to be present, then that would be great. But unfortunately, time zones are stupid. Time zones are stupid, and the world is dumb, is basically what we're saying. We should all be able to take time off work just for Dear Mr. Potter. That's what I think. Anyway, all right, that is going to do it. I really have to call it quits there. Guys, thank you so much for joining me. I will talk to you all next week when we conclude Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. Until then, thanks for listening. Mischief managed. Good night, all.